Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. In short, hello from wherever it is around the world that you are joining us today, and a very warm welcome. My name is Katie Harris. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute and Director of the Adaptation Without Borders Global Partnership. And it is my great pleasure and honor to be your chair for today's Global Food Systems Dialogue on food security, conflict, and resilience. The Food Systems Summit will be held in September to awaken the world to the fact that we must all work together to transform the way the world produces, consumes, and thinks about food, to kick off an agenda for action to 2030. In the process leading up to the summit, all UN member states have been invited to hold national dialogues in preparation. Sweden held its first national dialogue in January, and since then, 2 regional dialogues have been held as well. To complement these 3 dialogues, the Swedish Development Agency, Sida, the Swedish Ministry for Innovation and Enterprise, the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and the Swedish International Agriculture Network Initiative, SIANI, are convening a series of 3 further food systems dialogues that will feed into the summit and provide some global perspectives to Sweden's preparations. The first of those dialogues looked at equitable and inclusive food systems. The notes from that will soon be available on SIANI's and the government's websites, but you can already now watch a recording of the opening session and also take a look at a summary article. In that dialogue, Karin Jämtin, the Director General of Sida, urged us to listen to each other with big ears. And I echo her words again today. This event, in which the Stockholm Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, joins the other conveners I mentioned a moment ago, is Sweden's second Global Food Systems Dialogue. And as I mentioned, we'll be focusing on the links between food security, conflict, and resilience. The dialogue will discuss issues related to Action Track 5 in the Food Systems Summit, which is building resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks, and stress. OCHA estimates that armed conflict is the main driver of acute hunger for 77 million people in 22 countries. I cannot think of a more profound or urgent issue for us to be discussing today. This is a chance for all of us to hear from and really listen to each other. We all interact with food systems in one way or another, and no one should fear that their insights are less significant than others. Some may have worked on this issue for their whole lives and bring a wealth of experience to the table. For others, this will be a newer field, but you bring fresh perspectives and important challenges. So in short, everyone is welcome here today. So we're going to start in plenary, where you'll hear from a range of inspiring and knowledgeable speakers. And in about an hour's time, we'll then break into smaller groups convened by some amazing facilitators to discuss visions for our future food systems and how you think we can best reach them. Before ending the dialogue, everyone will meet back in plenary to report back from your discussions. And we'll make sure you have time to refill your cups of tea and coffee and take a short break as well. So without further delay, I'm delighted to turn to Janine Alm Eriksson, State Secretary to the Minister for International Development Cooperation at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, for some welcoming remarks. State Secretary, we're delighted to hear from you.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Katie, and good morning to you all. On behalf of the Swedish government and the co-organizers of this Food Systems Dialogue, SIPRI, Sida, and SIANI, it's my great pleasure to welcome you this morning. And I also want to say a special thanks to SIANI, who is putting this dialogue together. Growing up, I could not have imagined that the year 2021, we would still be grappling with widespread hunger and the risk of famine on this scale. After food insecurity decreased for decades, it has now been on the rise for several years. And this year we are facing an imminent risk of further deterioration. This takes place in a time when we produce more food than ever before, more than we can consume. Hunger is a man-made problem. This also means that it's a solvable problem. As was pointed out in an open letter signed by 260 civil society organizations from around the world earlier this month, people are not starving, they are being starved. The signatories called on governments to take action now, and I take this call seriously. It is therefore very timely for us to meet today to discuss food security, conflict, and resilience. According to the World Food Programme and the Food and Agricultural Organization, some 174 million people face a food crisis today, compared with 135 million last year. Over 30 million people are at an emergency level of acute food insecurity, which means that they stand on the brink of starvation. 3 places, Yemen, South Sudan, and Northeast Nigeria, already face starvation. Another 20 or so places may join them unless urgent action is taken. What many of these places have in common is that they are affected by conflict. Armed conflict is one of the main drivers of hunger. We also know that food insecurity and hunger can drive conflict, including through displacement and disputes over scarce resources, creating a vicious cycle. COVID-19, climate change-induced shocks, and reduced biodiversity add to the vulnerabilities of many of these already affected communities, with large impacts on food security and livelihoods. We also know that women and girls are disproportionately affected by these trends. Recognizing the link between conflict and food insecurity, Sweden brought this agenda to the UN Security Council during our memberships in 2017-2018. As a result, the Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2417, which for the first time drew attention to the need to prevent and end conflict-induced hunger. Today, it's more important than ever that we transform those commitments into actions through several measures. The first is rather obvious, and that is that we must step up efforts to prevent conflicts from breaking out in the first place and do more to end ongoing conflicts. The Security Council itself can and must do more to act proactively. One of the latest examples with rapidly deteriorating food security is Ethiopia and Tigray. However, beyond implementing Resolution 2417, it is equally important that we build and invest in resilience to help community withstand shocks. This includes taking action on climate-related security risks affecting food systems. Initiatives under Action Track 5 under the Food Systems Summit to ensure continued functionality of sustainable food systems in areas prone to conflict or natural disasters will be very important. We must move from words to deeds and operationalize the humanitarian development nexus. Finally, as governments and donors to both humanitarian response and long-term development, we must become better to anticipate risks and acting upon them before it's too late. More and larger prevention measures that strengthen the resilience of vulnerable people will be needed. These measures should be financed mainly through long-term development cooperation. That said, there is a scope for humanitarian actors to increase collaboration with development actors to create conditions for long-term action and measures to anticipate humanitarian crisis. And I am pleased to host a follow-up meeting on the 3rd of June to the high-level event Anticipate and Act held last October, together with the World Food Programme and UNDRR. So thank you, and I look forward to a productive debate.
Thank you so much, State Secretary, for setting the context for us and for really reminding us of the urgency with which this conversation takes place today. I have one follow-up question, if I may, which is just to ask you to reflect for perhaps just a minute more on how we can make sure that the ambition of the Food Systems Summit process to build stronger, healthier, more inclusive and resilient food systems can really benefit those living in conflict areas that really are most at risk of food insecurity.
Well, thank you. I think that the process leading up to the Food Systems Summit provides an opportunity for us to think about how food systems can drive and promote peace. And we cannot leave behind those at most risk of severe food insecurity. And the right to adequate food must be ensured. And I think about three aspects. As mentioned in my opening remarks, we must operationalize a nexus approach. A common understanding of needs, risks, vulnerabilities, resilience, and underlying causes of crisis and conflict is key. Humanitarian actors need to better prepare the ground for development actors through catalytic and time-limited interventions that in the long run contributes to reducing dependency on humanitarian aid and enable a transition to development actors. And the development actors need to accept greater risks and the complexity of crisis and step in at an early stage to seek synergies and complementarities with humanitarian assistance. We need to make long-term investments alongside immediate relief efforts to address root causes. And a good example of this is the World Food Programme and FAO's project in Burkina Faso, where they are meeting the basic food needs of more than 55,000 displaced people, while simultaneously supporting resilience and early recovery activities aimed at rebuilding livelihoods. And second, the Food Systems Summit must also address the issue faced by the small farmers. Small-scale farming is key, I think, to food systems that contribute to peaceful and healthy communities. And since small-scale farms often serve domestic and local markets, they play especially important roles in developing countries where hunger is more likely to provoke unrest. And it is critical to ensure continued access to market to these farmers. That is also something that we have seen as very important now in the COVID pandemic, where it has been shut down in many places. And finally, we must recognize the role of women in food systems. Women produce between 60 and 80% of the food in most developing countries, yet their key role as food producers and their critical contribution to household food security is only recently being recognized. Women still face discrimination and limited bargaining power. Both humanitarian responses to food insecurity and long-term efforts to restore agriculture and livelihoods must therefore address gender inequalities and increase women's economic empowerment, including by ensuring access to resources such as land and credit and productively enhancing inputs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, State Secretary, and I couldn't agree more on the need for a nexus approach and for this focus on support to small-scale farmers and also on recognizing the crucial role of women as part of the solution here. Thank you so much once again for joining us today. We're delighted to have you as part of this conversation. And it's now time for me to turn to Dan Smith, who is the director of the Stockholm Peace Research Institute, so SIPRI, for his keynote remarks. Dan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katie. And I want to start by thanking the co-conveners of this meeting, the Swedish government, especially the Foreign Ministry, SIANI and Sida. And we're very pleased to be part of this effort, because I think that one of the most important things to understand is that there is a two-way linkage between what you could think of as the different issues of food security and of peace. Food insecurity creates the conditions for insecurity, instability, and conflict. And we have seen this time and time again. We've seen it in the Middle East, we've seen it in Central and South Asia, we've seen it in South Asia, and we've seen it in Sub-Saharan Africa. We've also seen it in the Dry Corridor in Central America. And it creates, sometimes what it is leading to is political and social instability, and it stops short of outright violent conflict. But sometimes it leads on to outright violent conflict. And at the same time, as I think is clear to everybody who thinks about this for just a few seconds, instability, insecurity, and conflict undo food security. And one of the things that used to be said some kind of 20 years ago was that violent conflict was effectively in low-income countries. Violent conflict was effectively development going into reverse. And a part of good development should surely be the security of food supplies for everybody in a country. So, I mean, the evidence is clear. As I said, it doesn't always happen that food insecurity leads to conflict. The way that it happens when it does happen is different in every place. Nonetheless, there is enough evidence of this to be clear that there is a problem here that is important to address. Food security is foundational for peace, and we won't get a self-sustaining peace without it. At the same time, we won't get food security without peace. So we have to be addressing these two sets of issues together. In fact, we have to, in this context, as we think about food security, conflict and peace, think of this as one issue. Now, I have sort of three reflections which I want to offer on the basis of that very broad, general, quick platform. The first one, and this is a question for everybody. I can see at the bottom of my Zoom screen a really nice large number of people who are taking part in this national dialogue today. It's extremely important. Why do you think it is so hard to get the point? Why are we still arguing about that basic point that peace and food are linked? I mean, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee got it. Why can't everybody get it? Why are we still having this argument with donor governments who say, no, 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 or whose departments within those governments say, no, 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 we don't do peace. We're doing development here, and the part of development we're doing is food. Why do we have to argue this out in agencies? Why are they not seeing, especially when they work on the front line of conflict, providing food support, why are they not seeing the interaction? Why are we having to argue it out with NGOs? Now, in some sense, I don't want the answer to that question. I just want it's a rhetorical question, right? I just want it to be clear that there is a logic here which I think it is impossible to contravene. So therefore we have to think of what to do about it. And especially, and this is the second reflection I want to offer, is we have to think about it because left to itself or left to themselves, these problems and these issues will get worse. I mean, I look at what you could call business as usual, business as we have seen it in the last few years in the international system. I look at what is happening in different countries, the pressures which they face even before the pandemic came along. And I see a security agenda and therefore also a humanitarian agenda in the late 2020s and the 2030s, which is kind of horrifying. And I hear the warnings coming from the humanitarian leaders. I hear Mark Lowcock, David Beasley, Peter Maurer of the ICRC, Filippo Grandi of UNHCR. I hear them warning that unless something is done about preventing the issues from emerging, then the frontline agenda is going to be almost impossible. It's going to be overwhelming. A calculation within UNDP, which I learned about last week, suggests that 2% of overseas development assistance worldwide is spent on conflict prevention. Right? We have to get better than that. Because in this sense, food and peace is part of the story, but there are also the other issues which we need to think about, the driving effects of climate change on hunger and on social instability. The effect of rising inequality, which is going to be made worse by the economic consequences of the pandemic. The way in which the pandemic itself, by hitting economies, drove over 100 million people into poverty during the course of 2020. And the background of toxic geopolitics, which we've been watching for the last few years. All of this is acting together to create this extremely unpleasant prospect unless we grab the logic and do something about it. Now, what to do? I think the first thing to say is that the idea that there is a two-way linkage presupposes that the action must cover both ends of that. It cannot be just about peace and not paying proper attention to food security, to nutrition and so on, nor can it just be about those food related issues and not paying proper attention to dialogue and conflict resolution and bringing contending groups together. In the context of the Food Systems Summit, there has emerged from discussions in Action Track 5, the Resilience Track, the idea of a food and peace facility to be established in conflict affected countries. It could be linked to the global network against food crisis. It would give a place on the ground in the conflict affected countries, even it could have feet in the conflict affected regions. It would therefore be, in terms of the analysis and the program it was doing, highly context specific, and one cannot overemphasize the importance of context specificity in the context of peace building. It will be able to be inclusive of local voices, of women, of diverse social and ethnic groups. It will be able to link local action to international assistance, which is the kind of the red thread that we need all the time, that they work together and not against each other. It'll be able to identify local problems and address them in place. So that at least is one idea which I'd like to put forward. And thank you very much for your attention, everybody, and apologies for my insistence on asking rhetorical questions.
No, thank you very much, Dan. Thank you for emphasizing the incontrovertible logic, as you put it, that this is the one issue we are discussing today, and quite an eye-opening statistic there around the 2% of development assistance that is spent on conflict prevention. I'm going to ask you, challenge you just for a minute or two further on, where do you think are the real gaps then in our knowledge and understanding about the connections between conflict and food security? And you already mentioned kind of one idea, but if you had to distill the decisive actions that the world needs to take in terms of changes in policy and practice that would recognize these issues as one, what would be top of the agenda for you?
I think in terms of the knowledge gap, I'll draw a parallel with climate change. Do we think global warming is happening? Yes, the evidence is incontrovertible. Is it changing the climate? Yes, the evidence is incontrovertible. Do I know what the climate is going to look like on Södermalm, where I live, in 2028? No, I don't, right? So there's a detail in our knowledge which we haven't got. It's very hard to take these general arguments into national context and there make reliable forecasts of likelihood of what will happen. So I think the knowledge gap is not around the big question of are food and peace issues connected and in two ways, but exactly how does that play out in, let's say, in Mali, or close to Mali, but not with open conflict yet, in Niger. What is the risk in Niger? There's a knowledge gap. Where we could go further in understanding the local specificities of all of this. You asked about distilling action. So if I take the kind of principles, I think I'm almost tempted into like 3 R's. I think I can make this work. One is risk. I think one has to be thinking about risk management, and that includes therefore the prevention agenda. The more you address risk early, the less you have to address the crises, which are tragic and consume extreme amounts of energy and resources. I think the second R is a realignment. We keep on talking about how we've got to break down the silos. What we should be talking about is how we can manage some kinds of both analytical and policy, but also organizational realignment to get the integrated action happening. And that's why I think that the Food and Peace Facility is so important, because it is an example of that realignment in concrete terms. And the third thing, the R which people like you and me always mention, is resources. I mean, this has got to be properly resourced. I don't actually think that it's enormously expensive, right? Because it involves people doing things. It's not necessarily the cost of these huge infrastructure projects and so on. But nonetheless, we need more than that, what seems to be a pretty small scale of resources that is put into it. And if I wanted to give you one word about the whole thing, I'm afraid I couldn't give you one that begins with an R. It would just be, we have to cooperate.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. loving the 3 R's there: risk, realignment, resources, and then ending on the need to cooperate, which is of course part of what we're doing here today, live in action. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So it is now my great pleasure to welcome our second keynote speaker today, Amir Abdullah, Deputy Executive Director of the UN World Food Programme, WFP, which recently won the Nobel Peace Prize for its work providing life-saving food assistance to millions worldwide, often in dangerous and conflict-affected locations. Amir, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katie, and obviously thanking very much Sweden and especially the State Secretary and all the other entities for holding this important dialogue ahead of the Food Systems Summit. And if I can just pick up on something that the State Secretary made before I dig in here, and that was about conflict being man-made. Which I couldn't agree with more. And unfortunately, the emphasis there is actually on the man. She also mentioned the need, if we're going to get these solutions right, especially on agriculture and production of food as part of dealing with the conflict and hunger nexus, we need to make sure that women are more engaged. You know, the role that women, first the impact on women and girls, but the role that women play, especially in smallhold farmers, but not only in that area. So in a sense, in my view, there's a woman-led solution. So I've said before that, you know, what gives me hope and optimism to keep carrying on is that for every man-made problem, there is a woman-led solution. So I think we need to keep a focus on that too. And the Food Systems Summit is a time for us to focus. It's the time for the international community to commit to a comprehensive transformation that addresses food security through more productive, inclusive, and resilient food systems, but also to advance progress across all the different sustainable development goals. And I was very encouraged, Katie, to see that you're wearing the pin. In particular, the Food Systems Summit Action Traction 5 covers a number of themes that are crucial to ensuring that food systems are sustainable. And we have already heard about some of them: the humanitarian development peace nexus, disaster risk reduction, adaptation to climate change, social protection, and keeping it local, localization. And Sweden plays a key role in advancing these cross-cutting issues through its global leadership, its strategic flexible funding to UN agencies. They're one of the most flexible to the World Food Programme, and multi-year support to resilience programs in several countries where WFP, amongst others, operate. WFP's mandate, our strategic alignment with the 2030 agenda, keeping our eye on the goals, and recent adherence to the OECD DAC recommendation on the humanitarian development peace nexus, or the HDP nexus, place us as key contributors to this triple nexus, helping to end hunger, build self-resilience, and prevent the recurrence of crisis over time. So today, we need more than ever, we need a holistic approach to address the main drivers of food insecurity: conflict and climate shocks. And both of these result in instability in societies. And last year truly showed us the importance of building resilience at all levels. In many countries, 2020 was not only the year of a devastating COVID-19 pandemic, it was also one of the hottest years on record, a year of destructive heat waves, wildfires, floods, storms, and locust outbreaks. So when we talk about resilience in WFP, we talk about programs and systems that help communities to absorb, adapt, and transform their resilience in the face of these shocks. And we know that there will be more climate shocks in the future. And we know that these shocks will come in tandem often with forced displacement, conflict, public health and financial crisis, increased scarcity of water where it is needed, and often greater flooding where it's not needed. And we know that we're going to need to prepare for bigger and more frequent and more in number of responses to bigger and more in increased emergencies. And we know that there is too little investment in disaster prevention, in risk reduction and resilience building. There is not enough resource to pick up on that third R put into this. So that's why in 2021, WFP has decided to really get out there and rap. And I don't mean that we will be out there necessarily singing, because R stands for restoring natural solutions against climate hazards. The A for anticipating climate hazards and acting before lives need saving. And P for protecting the most vulnerable with climate risk insurance and safety nets for those who need them. So if we want to protect communities and ecosystems from the worst scenarios of the unfolding climate emergency, we must work with nature rather than against it. And if we respond to global challenges with solutions that combine the well-being of people and planet, we can solve the most pressing problems of poverty, food insecurity, biodiversity loss. We can do it all together whilst we still have this ongoing runaway climate scenario that we need to bring under control. But another message that we heard loud and clear in 2020 is the call for addressing the third pillar of the triple nexus, peace. So just a little bit of data about that. Of the world's nearly 700 million acutely hungry people, about 60% live in countries affected by conflict. More than half of the 135 million who really face acute extreme hunger in the world were living in 22 countries affected by conflict and insecurity. About 2/3 of WFP's life-saving food assistance goes to people facing severe food crisis, and most of them caused by conflict. So Dan, we know the answer to your rhetorical question. We're true believers. So WFP is working together with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, to better understand how hunger fighting programs contribute to advancing peace and reducing social tensions. Initial findings show that the types of programs and how you implement them can reduce tensions and bring competing communities together. And the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize and the reemergence of famine-like conditions in several countries and gives attention to Security Council Resolution 2417. And I believe that attention is gaining momentum. And as the Secretary of State stated, that groundbreaking resolution was adopted unanimously in 2018. And thanks a lot to the tireless support of Sweden, who were one of the pen holders. And again, Sweden amongst those leading the way. So in 2021, the Food Systems Summit will serve as an important momentum for the international community to sustainably address different areas of this triple nexus. As a global community, we need to support the resilience of food systems by some of the following key actions: linking food systems with robust social protection systems. They need to have systems that allow us to meet people's immediate needs while dealing with shocks and stresses. Inclusive and increasing the inclusiveness, resilience, and efficiency of food supply chains. And here again, especially as was mentioned by the Secretary of State, for women and smallholder farmers, so that they can benefit from opportunities of healthy food systems. We also need to ensure that all families have access to quality, nutritious diets, reducing food loss and waste, and to ensure food safety. As the Secretary of State mentioned, nowadays we produce more food than we ever have, but the loss and waste means that people also are still going hungry. And finally, incentivizing green practices in the production, processing, and distribution of food. And as we're the anchor agency for Action Track 5, we in WFP are really trying to leverage our expertise to ensure that food systems are more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive. Some examples: we're introducing game changers such as nutrition-sensitive social protection and in our homegrown school feeding, and looking for local and public procurement schemes to make these really homegrown and home-owned. Streamlining the nexus approach with regards to humanitarian peace and development outcomes, working closely with partners such as SIPRI the Global Network Against Food Crisis, to ensure that they're fully reflected in a systemic approach to food systems, and hopefully one of the outcomes of the Food Systems Summit. Ensuring that context, specificity, localization of food systems are captured and valued, and that the summit is an inclusive process supporting the national food system dialogue, such as today. Factoring in the key outcomes from the Food Systems Summit is the way we will take this forward in our strategic plan for 2022 to 2026 and beyond on to 2030, to coordinate across actors and stakeholders. And we want to ensure that the summit is not merely just a lineup event or the end of things in September 2021, but rather it should be the starting line for that marathon that we have ahead of us to reach zero hunger. The 2020 Nobel Peace Prize has been a platform to amplify the voices of those who face hunger daily, and a momentum for us to mobilize support for them. But we share this prize with many others, including Swedish public actors, civil society, academia, and private sector, as true front runners when it comes to promoting sustainable, conflict-sensitive, and climate-adaptive ways of working globally. So I hope that these examples and thoughts that Dan and myself have given of the positive impacts that we all want to see, the stories we want to hear more often, especially in these days when all these different crises, and in a sense those right now the three C's, the conflict, conflict, climate, and COVID. We need Dan's 3 hours to battle those three C's. But I hope that through your dialogue today, that this event will help and inspire us and you to come together and wrap, restore, anticipate, and protect. So wrap together at the Food Systems Summit and wrap together for peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amir. And yeah, I'm looking forward to loving that call for action, looking forward to perhaps hearing some wraps from our small group discussions later, restoring, anticipating, protecting. Fantastic. Thank you so much also for making so many great points there in terms of the need to link food systems to social protection, to increase the inclusiveness and resilience of our supply chains, to ensure that all families have nutritious diets, to incentivize green practices, and of course the number of other actions you mentioned there as well. You talked about the three C's and conflict, crisis, and COVID, and I just ask you to reflect for just a minute, because we don't have hugely long this morning, but on the COVID-19 pandemic and how it is impacting the work of the World Food Programme, how you were trying to respond in the face of this, and what you see as the implications of the pandemic for what Action Track 5 of the Food Systems Summit can achieve.
Well, COVID-19, the pandemic, was clearly a wake-up call about the vulnerabilities of food systems and of all the different stakeholders involved in them, but especially the most marginalized. It's taken a devastating toll on health and incomes of families and communities across the world, but always affecting the poorest, the most vulnerable, worst. So, as I've said, conflict, climate change, but with COVID-19 and its fallout on jobs, livelihoods, it's driven millions of people deeper into hunger and poverty. And, we now have a record 235 million people who will need humanitarian assistance and protection in 2021. That's about a 40% increase on 2020. And that rise is almost entirely brought on by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we're also seeing at the same time markets, supply chain, trade disruptions. All of these have limited people's food, access to food, but already, and often in areas already affected by food insecurity. So the pandemic has also interrupted education systems. For many, that interruption in education systems has interrupted the learning. But for those who relied on a school meal, we have 370 million school children who rely on school meals. They missed out in many instances on that. So what have we been doing about that? I mean, clearly we also had a role in providing common services to the entire humanitarian community, which WFP is well known through our logistics capacity, both in moving people and goods around the world. But On the program side, we scaled up programmatic support to governments, helping, increase social protection, school feeding programs, where the schools weren't in session, making them about take-home rations for children, most vulnerable children. And we also scaled up investments to build community assets, addressing livelihood issues so that targeted groups could meet their food security needs, but also develop skills to find employment in what will be a new employment market post the COVID-19. We also have focused a lot on scaling up our cash-based transfers to mitigate the socio-economic impact of COVID-19. And those cash-based transfers are invariably often the easiest thing to hand over to governments to take on themselves. So basically, I believe the pandemic has showcased how important food system resilience is, and the need for us to refocus all these different global agendas around building capacities to overcome shocks and stresses of the future. And Action Track 5, but also more broadly, the whole work of the Food System Summit can play a role in this, ensuring that we come out of this with resilient, sustainable. We won't come out of it, but of the summit, but we should come out of the summit with a pathway to resilient, sustainable, and inclusive food systems, which will give all of us on this planet a better chance of coping with possible future pandemics and really meeting the mantra of Agenda 2030 and the SDGs to ensure that no one is left behind.
Thank you so much, Amir. Fantastic. So we are now going to have a dialogue on resilient food systems, convened by Lena Gordon, Director of the Stockholm Resilience Centre and part of the leadership group for Action Track 5. And she's going to be in conversation with Kristin Hall from the Power of Nutrition and Georges Buzongo, who's Director of Operations for Tree Aid. Lena, it's really a delight to hand over the conversation to you now for the next sort of 25 or so minutes. And I wanted to ask, after hearing these really inspiring and rousing and these calls to action from the keynote speakers, what are your thoughts on the issues raised and what is needed to create resilient food systems?
Thanks a lot. And first of all, thanks for letting me moderate this discussion. I think that the UN Food Systems Summit is such an important opportunity. And one of the reasons it is so important is that we're now at a time where solutions are so urgently needed. The whole pandemic situation over the last year has really shaken our societies. And despite the hardship and the devastation that has followed in the aftermath of this, we also need to see this as an opportunity. And when I say it's an opportunity, it is an opportunity sort of to reimagine our relationship with each other and reimagine our relationship with nature and the biosphere that support our societies. This is really a time to rethink our moral compass and how we relate to each other. We have, through the past year, been physically distant, but I think it's never been as important to stay socially close. And in the previous keynotes here today, we've heard how food security is the basis for building resilience to conflict. Without it, there's no way that we can have a conflict-free world and reduce the vulnerability of the most vulnerable areas around the world. But the State Secretary also reminded us that hunger is a man-made problem, that we have the volume, we have the food that's needed to solve this, and therefore it's also a solvable problem. And it's just that it's so unevenly distributed. So when going into the thinking about solutions, we need to think about both the local solutions that we can do in different contexts, but also how we as a global society can support and reduce that vulnerability through different types of actions. And to do this, we really need to work together, and we need to work with nature, as was also pointed out in the previous talk. So in this panel that I'm moderating, it will take us to this local level. And I just want to urge us to be bold in our thinking, and that this is a time that we have to rethink what we are actually doing. So with that, I want to go to the two panelists, George Basongo, who's the Director of Operations of Aid, and has more than 2 decades of experience in both national and international organizations like FAO and the Ministry of Environment. And also to Kristin Hall, from the Power of Nutrition. And I'm really glad that we have this combination of nutrition and also experience from agriculture with us in this panel. And Kristin, you also have nearly 15 years of experience working in child and adolescent nutrition and across various contexts, and primarily focused on hunger relief efforts. But my first question to you both are, in the work that you're doing, how can you see how we can work with this building resilience on a very practical level? And I would just like to start with George. So how can we take this to be practical on the ground?
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Thank you for the organizer for bringing me to this wonderful panel, because and this dialogue. We learn a lot and we share our experience. Regarding your question, I think that it's from all the speech and what I understood is what we need to do from what we are doing in the field is to build the community's resilience, supporting them to improve with access to food by using what is available in the villages, in the countries, which are really, really important. And then also looking at how to diversify the source of food. Because basically in our countries, when we talk about, when you look at all the statistics about around food security, is more focused on producing crops, sometimes animal and fish. But we left behind all these aspects, the huge amount of and non-timber forest products which are available in the villages at all time in the year. If you take across the year, you can have at all time this kind of food which are available in the villages. But we focus by, letting the community know that food security, quality and quantity means you have a lot of crop to eat, you have a lot of maybe meat to eat. While we know that in this forest product, we have a huge source of vitamin and also a protein and others for the human body. And we are supporting this in the villages, and even for the displaced people. The statistics show that the main need for the 85% of people are food. They need food. But why? How to produce? Because they're displaced, they're not in they left the land where they came from, they're in the new communities, the land is even not enough to produce. So what to do? So first, we help them and support them to see how they can start to eat what is already available in the environment. And then the other support, sometimes it takes some time, 1 week, 2 weeks, and 1 day for human body is really important. Human life is very important when we are in emergency aspect. So if they can do this, they'll make them alive to be more resilient at this short term before all the support coming from other people. So for me and for our organization is look at first what is available in the communities. And second, go beyond crops and meat and look also how we can use this forest product to build the resilience and diversify the source of even income, but also food and nutrition status. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, George. Some of my research has actually been in Burkina Faso and around the Great Green Wall of the Sahara and the Sahel. And I think you're pointing to some of the key issues there, which really has to do with this diversification, which is also one of the fundamental principles of resilience building. So how do we diversify the food portfolio by actually looking at what's already available in landscapes? And the other thing is also, how do we really work with landscape scale approaches, which is also such an important part of resilience building. I'm going to come back to you in a little bit, but first go to Christine. What are you doing, and what do you see as key issues to work with on a very practical level?
Thanks very much for having me. So I think just to start out, that according to UN OCHA, countries with the highest levels of undernourishment tend to be those recently or currently experiencing violent conflict, which we know disrupts food production and undermines agricultural development. And we know that drivers of humanitarian need are growing at unprecedented levels. We have record finance, but it still isn't enough. We know that the system is overwhelmed and overstretched. And maybe more importantly, it's not really designed to channel aid most effectively as the shocks that we're experiencing present today. Many of them are protracted, spanning decades. And so we really need to prioritize using resources and partnerships effectively as possible outside of these traditional aid systems. And that's where the organization that I work for comes in. So the Power of Nutrition was created to really disrupt these traditional aid flows and bring money that's a bit more fluid and flexible to be able to span both the humanitarian and development spaces. It also incentivizes private sector investment into the space and tries to incentivize government resources, so domestic resources to nutrition through a variety of systems. So we've heard a couple of systems already mentioned today. Obviously, food systems is what the conversation is about, but nutrition interventions through health systems and also social protection systems as well. So we channel those investments in a practical way to specific countries with the most need. So we look at stunting as a prevalence indicator for our engagement. And we work through to, with the country governments to build community resilience, including through poverty alleviation. So cash transfers, WFP has mentioned already, we do some cash transfer programming. And really ensure that localization of care is a focus, in addition to health system strengthening, to make sure that the nutrition interventions that we provide can go through the health system in a very effective and efficient manner. And then more broadly, as I mentioned, we're looking at food systems approaches as well to tack on to these nutrition specific approaches so that we make sure that these systems are working harder for those that we support. So not only are we doing the nutrition interventions offered through health systems, but we're also doing and supporting dietary diversity and positive nutrition outcomes through food systems as well, because we know that good nutrition is really essential for making progress on any and all of the sustainable development goals. And the more channels that we can really channel nutrition interventions through, the better.
Fantastic, thanks a lot for that. I think it's interesting also that we have this both very local level work and then the type of support that's needed also to enable this to work. But I want to go into also what are the major challenges that you see from both of your perspectives right now to have a big change in the food system and to build resilience. So what are the largest challenges? Let's go back to you, George.
Okay, thank you. I think that the larger challenges will be we should involve the politician or political people in the development dialogue. It's very important because some of them may be part of the conflict which we are seeing in the ground. And what we know with this conflict also impacts really the food insecurity. That's very important. The second aspect, it's a challenge. It's the land tenure perspective. And you know, in the policies, we have some land tenure policies and approaches how to make sure we secure the communities in their land, because nobody will invest in a land to restore, to make it more, to produce more food if they are not secure, and to be sure that they'll continue to grow for some time. And this is also the reality of a displaced people or people who are in this. So this is a key challenge also to look at and to make sure that people are really secure where they are growing, where they are restoring the land, and they are investing to have more productivity. And the third one is challenge will be, you know, we are facing a complex situation, problem, which means some integrated solution and also some multi-actors work and approaches and system to be put in place. How the big challenge will be how all these multiplicity of actors can work together, you know, to harmonize what we are doing, not to have in the ground several approaches coming, several you know, solution, but same, not same solution, but to harmonize what we are doing in the field. I think that with these 3 points for me are really key in terms of challenge we can look at for the next time.
Thanks a lot for that. And I want to turn to you then, Kristin, also to follow up on that. From your perspective, what are the major challenges? And I can see that you also are working with these very complex multi-actor situations. So maybe add on to that.
Sure, thanks. And many of the speakers have already alluded to this, but I think the fragmented approach to aid is really common and often the norm, but it's not really effective in creating resilient and thriving populations. And you know, perhaps more specifically, many of the efforts and actors who engage this aid are focused on either short or long-term needs and not both, and engage through efforts through one system, but maybe not all, which slows progress. But this is understandable, of course, when you look at donor funding flows and the architecture that's tied to them. But if you take Burkina Faso, for instance, or DRC, they're in a constant state of protracted crisis. And this disjointed way of receiving and spending aid isn't really sufficient there. And there's never really a space under that current structure to build purposeful resilience when you're only ever in a state of emergency. So funding that is not going to help build in that way. It's not going to help build resilience. So from our organization, what we do is we try to span those spaces and really coordinate a response which works a bit better for those who we're meant to serve and support. And so we look at supporting both immediate crisis needs and longer term needs in tandem at the same time as part of the same program. And I think it's really important that it's not this or that, it's this and that. And one example is in Madagascar, where we've been supporting this shift of cyclical humanitarian response to a more development and resilient focused long-term one. And we've been doing that in partnership with both the World Bank and also the government of Madagascar. And from that work, the government has developed now a 10-year strategy on nutrition, which focuses kind of, again, on both short and long-term needs. And it's really been helpful that the president of Madagascar, of course, is a huge nutrition champion. He's an African Leaders for Nutrition champion, and he's working with nutrition at the highest level, which is helping to trickle down, this movement really within the government. I think another example is in DRC, where we know that displaced populations from neighboring countries are putting pressure on public resources, including food. And then when you pair that with internal conflicts in the country, which are also creating interruptions within delivery systems for public services, it makes for a really complex place to work. But it highlights why the nutritional needs are the greatest and why we need to really partner for greatest impact. So you see 27 million people are acutely malnourished in DRC at the moment, 27 million people. And we know that, to support those people, immediate hunger relief is never going to be enough anywhere really, but especially in a country which faces a variety of shocks most days. So we're really working with Sida right now, the Power of Nutrition, and the government of DRC to create a holistic nutrition program, which aims to both kind of cure and address these food insecurity issues in the short term, while building up and out preventative nutrition structures in the longer term to support building a resilient population. And we're doing that because we know that if communities aren't resilient from the start, these shocks really hit them harder. So we're trying to build and defragment the partnership and humanitarian development space to make sure that we're able to achieve nutrition outcomes across the food system and health system and social protection system to make sure that we can really achieve the sustainable development goals, and specifically SDG 2, zero hunger.
But that's really important points. And I think earlier we talked about diversity and diversification as an important building block of resilience. And here is also another building block, is this kind of thinking about the slow variables, things that keep changing under the surface, and the importance that we also see them and invest in them. And I think when you're talking, that's what I think about, this need to have both immediate investments and long-term investments, and that they need to go hand in hand for us to find the right solutions. Our time is rapidly coming up, so we have another 6 minutes or so. And with those, I really want you to take this opportunity to tell us, what do you see are the needed actions that really can help us move forward? What are your hopes for this UN Food Systems Summit, and what should we bring to the table for the solutions for more resilient food systems? George, you go first.
Okay, so I think first of all it's a good opportunity for all the actors to really be open. For me, I think to be really open, because usually like some organizations like To Aid, we are working in the people and also government. Sometimes we for this kind of big conferences or dialogue, sometimes people are looking after their own interests rather than looking at what is really the need of the communities, because all of us, all the dialogue, all the speeches we are doing, the programs is for the same target. People who need the support, who need to improve their food and nutrition status. So if we have in our mind these people, these communities, then we'll have some frank dialogue and people will provide some practical solution. Yes, academic solutions are good, but how to make sure that this academic solution can really be applied in the field. So for me, it's very important to have in mind the need of the people in the ground. And the second will be, if possible, to bring in that conference, that dialogue, some people who could be the voices of, of the people and in the countries where we have some conflict. They may well express what we are doing. We are working with them day to day, so we can easily talk for them. But sometimes, if this kind of big dialogue, if it's possible, that will be really good. So for me, if I will bring something to the table, is people to really be realistic, practical solution, and the time is not with us, because the climate crisis is there. The food and nutrition insecurity is increasing. So we need to move quickly. We really need to move quickly.
Thanks, George. A good reminder also of the importance of bringing practical solutions and also people into dialogues. And I think also that this is why this type of dialogues are held today and in so many places around the world is such an important part also of the Food Systems Summit and the lead up to it. So Christine, your takeaway message to the Food Systems Summit.
So I would hope that there's more resources and partnerships mobilized to really transform food systems. I think food systems have obviously been going for a long time, but in terms of high-level conversations around them, it's only been for about the past decade or so. So really bubbling up this topic on the political agenda and make sure that it's funded accurately across all forms of aid and finance, ensuring that resilience is really built into the development side of aid and actioned in tandem with the humanitarian measures. I think I'd also like to see, as a nutrition organization as well, we're really working on the Nutrition for Growth Summit. So making sure that these moments are really purposefully and thoughtfully tied together, because we know that they impact on each other. So I'd like to see that as well.
Thanks a lot. And it is time to finish off, but I think this was a really good discussion, and thanks for your input into the summit. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much all, and thank you, Lena, for coordinating and convening that conversation. A few key takeaways for me, among many, but this need to reimagine our relationships with each other and the world, and to harness this opportunity at the moment to rethink our moral compass, to really harmonize what we're doing and work together at a community level, given how many different actors there are in this space, to think about more fluid and flexible funding to span some of the silos on this, to think about building resilience over the long term to better withstand shocks. The need to be realistic and practical and really respond to the needs of people, and really listen to those on the front line and hear their solutions and proposals for way forward, and to encourage more collaboration and partnership, and to join the dots in the big moments in the run up to the Food Systems Summit, and then of course beyond. So thank you so much for that really engaging and informative conversation. I'd just like to take a moment now to thank all our speakers and contributors so far, and to thank everyone who has followed us through the live stream on Facebook. And we hope that you will continue to connect with us at future dialogues, and really wish you well. Thank you so much. Thank you all for sharing your insights and reflections. I'm really sorry to those groups that we weren't able to call upon today, but as I said, please rest assured that your comments will be captured in the notes taken forward, and we'll be fully accounting for your views and thoughts and ideas. So I'd now like to turn to the Director of Humanitarian Aid at Sida, Jakob Verneman, for some concluding remarks. Jakob.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katie. First of all, I'd like to thank all the distinguished speakers and panelists for taking the time today to participate in this event and to share your experiences and perspectives. I'd like to also recognize SIANI, a long-term partner to Sida, and thanking you for helping us arrange these dialogues. But maybe most importantly, I'd like to thank all the participants engaging in this dialogue and engaging in these group works that we've just been hearing back from today. Truly appreciate your engagement. The world today is facing a number of challenges to the vision of a world without hunger. 5 years into the 2030 agenda, it's questionable whether our current efforts will be enough to allow countries to reach the SDG 2 targets of zero hunger, as the number of people that are suffering from hunger has started to increase again in recent years after decades of decline. As we've been hearing, conflict has also increased in many parts of the world and remains the main driver of food crisis. More than 80% of resources requested by UN humanitarian appeals in the last years have been for action in conflict situations. And we heard from Mr. Abdullah at the WFP about the incredible number of people suffering from acute food insecurity globally, and how a majority of these people live in conflict-affected areas. As famine alerts bells are ringing again, lately in countries such as South Sudan, Yemen, and Nigeria, Sida is committed not only to prioritizing the severe humanitarian needs arising from this worrying trends, where we obviously are working together with our partners to save lives in the most extreme of situations, but we're also committed to addressing the root causes to these situations. We live in a world today where humanitarian needs have increased with over 40% in only 1 year. In a world where 1 out of 33 people are in need of humanitarian assistance, and in a world where aid budgets, unfortunately, are not increasing in the same pace as these needs. Needless to say, humanitarian assistance may be the remedy for the most acute part of the situation, but it's far from the solution to the bigger problem. As said very well, I believe, by Mr. Smith at CIPRI, unless the bigger problem of hunger and conflict is addressed in a comprehensive manner, this situation will get even worse. Therefore, Sida is also committed to finding ways to addressing the underlying risk factors contributing to growing hunger, and doing so by investing in solutions that are sustainable, that are resilient to volatility and shocks. And this is an effort that must be carried out by humanitarian, development, and peace actors together, recognizing the relationship between food insecurity, conflict, and lack of development investments. If handled wisely, the recovery after the COVID-19 pandemic could provide an opportunity to build back better, to ensure that our food systems do not solely focus on producing more food, but that they are resilient, sustainable to deliver affordable, healthy food for all. Hearing the discussions today about issues such as the linkages between conflict and hunger, linkages between food security and peace, how efforts by humanitarian development and peace actors need to collaborate within what we call the triple nexus, sustainable and equitable food systems that are needed to build resilience against conflict risks. This discussion gives me hope that there is indeed a strong commitment to finding a solution to this challenge. I'm also very impressed by the group discussions today, to be frank, and all the suggestions coming out of them, in particular, obviously the ones that are with regards to what Sweden can do better. We take these issues with us and we'll incorporate them in our future work. So, dear friends, I could continue for a long time, and this discussion today could very well have continued for a long time, and I'm sure the discussion will continue as we are moving closer to the UN Food Summit, UN Food Systems Summit in New York later this year. So I would like to thank you all again for participating, and I want to give a special thanks to you, Katie, for your excellent work for moderating this dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jakob, for those closing remarks and for reminding us once again of the urgency, particularly for those in South Sudan and Yemen and Nigeria and indeed all conflict-affected places around the world where food security is such an issue, that we cannot wait to take action. And we hope that the Global Food Systems Summit this year can deliver some of that change that is so urgently needed. So all that remains for me to do is thank all our speakers and contributors once again, to thank all of you for sharing your experiences, your insights, your ideas, your agendas for change. Please do keep an eye out on SIANI's website for the notes from this session. Please do mark your calendars for the 11th of May, when Sweden's third and final Global Food Systems Dialogue will focus on how to achieve increased food security, protection of biodiversity, sustainable food systems, and restoration of degraded areas simultaneously. What are the trade-offs, and how can we realize the human right to food within the boundaries of our planet? An invitation to that dialogue will be winging its way to your inboxes very shortly. And we look forward to seeing you there and wish you glad tidings and warmest regards until then. Thank you so much. Goodbye.